By sunrise in 1933, somewhere in Pennsylvania, the dog came back alone. Or rather, he did not come back at all, but his presence never left. A stocky bulldog named Mac, known to shadow the evening shift along the conveyor trestle at a coal tipple just outside a patch town in the anthracite region, had walked onto the catwalk toward the breaker during a wind lull one January evening and vanished between one breath and the next. The belt dust under the tipple showed no paw prints at all. An oil can, left sitting upright at the rail where Mac had last been seen, felt warm to the glove when the foreman touched it, though the January air bit like iron and the machinery stood cold. The tipple rose at the edge of a coal patch town in Pennsylvania, a place where company houses leaned close together along a single muddy lane, and the breaker's shadow touched every doorstep by 3 in the afternoon. Smoke from the breaker stack hung low in winter, and the taste of coal grit stayed in your throat no matter how many times you swallowed. The conveyor trestle ran 40 feet above the sorting floor, a narrow catwalk with handrails bolted to timber posts and a roof of corrugated tin that rattled when the wind came down off the ridge. The belt carried raw coal from the shaft mouth to the breaker house, where men and boys picked slate from the moving stream under lamps that swung with every gust. Winters here were hard and long, the kind that turned mud to iron and made the air ache in your lungs. The whole structure smelled of coal dust, creosote, and machine oil, and in winter the frost made the planks slick enough that men walked slow and kept one hand on the rail. Mac belonged to no one in particular. He had appeared at the tipple 3 years earlier, a barrel-chested dog with a gray muzzle and a limp in his left hind leg, and he had stayed. The evening shift crew fed him scraps from their dinner pails, and he slept in the breaker house near the boiler when the night turned cold. He knew the sound of the whistle and the rhythm of the belts, and he walked the catwalk most evenings just after the shift change, following the foreman or one of the older hands as they checked the rollers and the tension on the belt. He never barked. He never wandered far. Wives in the company houses said their husbands talked about that dog the way other men talked about dependable horses. Children waved to him from the lane below, and he would sit at the edge of the platform and watch them pass, his tail thumping slow against the planks. Men in Pennsylvania still speak of him as the kind of dog you trust not to do anything foolish. On the evening of January 14th, the wind had been blowing hard all day, rattling the tin roof and pulling coal dust through every crack in the breaker house walls. Around 4:30, as the light began to fail, the wind dropped all at once. The crew said later that the silence felt wrong, like the pause before a storm, though the sky stayed clear and the stars came out hard and bright. Mac was standing near the base of the trestle when the foreman, a man named Harlan Ketchel, started up the stairs to check a bearing that had been running hot. Harlan had worked the tipple for 11 years, and he knew every sound the machinery made. The dog followed him as he always did. Harlan climbed to the catwalk and turned south toward the breaker, and Mac came up behind him, his claws clicking on the planks in that steady rhythm everyone at the tipple knew by heart. Harlan walked 20 feet along the catwalk, stopped to inspect the bearing, and crouched down to feel the drum housing for heat. It took him maybe 30 seconds. When he stood and turned to call the dog back down, Mac was gone. The catwalk was empty in both directions. Harlan stood still, listening, but heard nothing except the faint creak of the trestle timbers settling in the cold. He walked back to the stairs and looked down at the sorting floor, thinking the dog might have slipped past him somehow, but the men below shook their heads. They had been watching the catwalk, waiting for Harlan to finish, and they had seen nothing. The floor was lit by overhead lamps, and there was nowhere for a dog to hide. Harlan climbed back up and walked the entire length of the catwalk, checking under the belt housing and behind the tension drums, but found no trace of Mac. The catwalk ran straight and narrow, with gaps in the decking no wider than a man's hand, and the railings stood solid on both sides. There was no place for a dog to fall through, and no reason for a dog like Mac to jump. What he did find was the oil can, sitting upright on the catwalk decking near the breaker end, exactly where Mac had been walking moments before. Harlan had placed it there himself that morning, cold from the tool shed, intending to grease the drum pulley before the end of the shift. When he picked it up just after sunset, the metal felt warm against his glove, as though it had been sitting near a fire. He set it down fast and backed away, his breath coming short. One of the younger men, a slate picker named Emile, climbed up to see what was wrong and touched the can barehanded. He said later that it was not just warm. It was hot enough to make him pull his hand back fast, though the air around it was freezing and the catwalk planks were slick with frost. The can left a faint mark on his palm, like a brand, that stayed red for 2 days and made his wife ask questions he did not want to answer. The crew searched the tipple that night with lanterns, walking every platform and checking every gap in the flooring wide enough for a dog to fall through. They found nothing. The belt dust that coated the catwalk planks showed bootprints from Harlan's climb, sharp and clear in the lamplight, but no paw prints at all, as though Mac had floated across the boards without touching them. Some of the men climbed down and searched the ground below the trestle, dragging their lanterns through the coal spoil and the frozen mud, checking the drainage culverts and the gaps between the timber pilings. There was no body, no blood, no sign that anything had fallen. The snow around the base of the trestle was undisturbed, and the frost on the planks below the catwalk had not been broken. 2 nights later, during the graveyard shift, 3 men working the shaker floor heard claws on the planks directly above them. The sound was steady and distinct, the same slow click-click-click that Mac's nails had made when he walked the catwalk. The machinery was shut down for maintenance, and the breaker house was silent except for the wind in the roof tin. The men looked up, but the catwalk was empty. The sound moved from one end of the breaker house to the other, following the path Mac used to take every evening, then stopped. One of the men, a loader named Frank, climbed up to check. He found nothing on the catwalk except a faint smell like hot metal or burning coal that should not have been there with the boiler cold and the belts still. Frank stood there in the dark with his lantern held high, and he said later he felt something brush past his leg, low and solid, though when he swung the light down there was nothing there. He climbed back down and told the others he was done for the night. After that week, men in Pennsylvania working the evening shift began to clear out by dusk. They no longer walked the catwalk alone, and they no longer stayed in the breaker house after the lamps were turned down. Harlan Ketchel, who had worked the tipple longer than anyone, told the younger men that some things do not need explaining. They just need respecting. The older hands told the younger ones, "You do not ignore a warm oil can on a frozen night, and you do not walk the trestle when the wind drops all at once." The company never posted a notice and the foreman never gave an order, but the rule spread through the coal patch as though it had been written down. 2 men, never one, and always before dark. People in Pennsylvania still follow that rule, even though the tipple has been torn down for decades and most of the men who worked there are gone. The timeline made no sense from the start. Harlan Ketchel had climbed the trestle stairs at 4:30 in the afternoon on January 14th, with Mac following close behind, and by 4:32, the dog was gone. 3 men on the sorting floor swore they had been watching the catwalk the entire time, waiting for Harlan to finish checking the bearing so they could restart the belt. None of them saw the dog leave. None of them saw anything fall. One of them, a man named Joseph Lark, said he looked away for maybe 5 seconds to adjust a lamp, and when he looked back up, the dog was no longer there. "He was just there," Joseph said later, standing in the lane outside the company store with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Then he wasn't. The crew reconstructed the evening hour by hour, trying to make the pieces fit. At 4 o'clock, Mac had been lying near the boiler in the breaker house where he always rested before the shift change. At 4:15, the whistle blew, and the dog got up and walked to the base of the trestle, the way he did every evening. At 4:28, Harlan started up the stairs and Mac followed. At 4:30, Harlan reached the catwalk and turned toward the breaker. At 4:32, he turned around and the dog was gone. The oil can was still warm when he touched it at 4:35. By 5 o'clock, 20 men were searching the tipple with lanterns, and by 6 the search had spread to the slag heaps in the culverts below the trestle. By midnight, there was nowhere left to look that had not already been walked over twice. But there were other details that did not fit the timeline at all. A woman named Clara Dennison, who lived in one of the company houses nearest the tipple, said she heard a dog barking at 4:45, a low, steady bark that came from somewhere near the breaker house. She knew it was not Mac, because Mac never barked, but the sound made her look out the window anyway. She saw nothing but the dark shape of the tipple against the evening sky. At 5:10, a boy named Thomas, no older than 10, told his mother he had seen a dog on the catwalk while the men were searching below. His mother told him to stop making things up, but the boy insisted. He said the dog had been standing near the breaker end, right where the oil can had been found, and it had looked down at the men with the lanterns for a long time before turning and walking back toward the stairs. When the men climbed up to check, there was nothing there. Thomas's mother made him stay inside after that, and she told the neighbors the boy had an active imagination, but her hands shook when she poured coffee that night. The search that first night was thorough and desperate. Men tied rag strips to the fence posts around the tipple to mark the search grid, and they walked shoulder to shoulder through the coal spoil, their lanterns swinging low to catch any sign of tracks or blood. They dragged hooks through the drainage ditch that ran along the north side of the trestle, thinking maybe the dog had fallen and been carried off by the thin trickle of meltwater, but the hooks came up clean. They checked under the breaker house, crawling through the narrow gap between the floor joists and the frozen ground, but found nothing except old tools and rusted tin. They climbed every ladder and checked every platform, calling for the dog even though they knew it made no sense to call. Dogs do not vanish. Dogs do not leave warm oil cans behind, and no footprints in the dust. On the second night, the search took on a different tone. The men were quieter and they moved more carefully, as though they were no longer looking for a dog but for something else they could not name. One of the younger slate pickers, a man named Peter, said he smelled smoke near the breaker end of the catwalk, a sharp metallic smell like burning coal or hot iron, though no fire had been lit and the machinery was cold. He climbed down fast and refused to go back up. Another man, working alone near the base of the trestle just after dark, heard footsteps on the catwalk above him. Slow, deliberate footsteps, too heavy to be a dog. He looked up and saw nothing, but the sound continued, moving from the stairs toward the breaker, then stopping. He marked the spot with a rag strip and called for the others, but when they climbed up together, they found nothing except the faint smell of hot metal that Peter had mentioned earlier. The dogs brought in to help with the search behaved strangely. 2 hounds, borrowed from a man who lived 3 miles up the ridge, followed Mac's scent from the boiler house to the base of the trestle stairs without hesitation. They climbed the first few steps, then stopped. Both dogs sat down at the same time, whining low in their throats, and refused to go any higher. Their owner pulled on the leads, but the dogs dug their claws into the wood and would not move. When he tried to carry one of them up, the dog twisted free and bolted back down the stairs, nearly pulling the man off his feet. The other dog followed, and both of them sat at the base of the trestle, staring up at the catwalk and whining until their owner gave up and took them home. After that, no one tried to bring dogs up the stairs again. By the third night, there were whispers. Some of the men said Harlan had seen something on the catwalk that he was not talking about, something that made him back away from the oil can so fast. Others said the dog had not vanished at all, that he had been taken, though no one could say by what or to where. A few of the older hands, men who had worked the coal fields in Pennsylvania for 30 years or more, said the tipple had always felt wrong, especially in winter when the wind dropped and the silence pressed down like a weight. They said you learned not to work alone up there after dark, and you learned not to ask too many questions about the things you heard or smelled when the machinery was still. One of them, a man named Ed Kovach, who had worked the breaker since before the war, said he had heard claws on the catwalk twice before in all his years there. Both times in winter, both times when the wind went still. He did not say what he thought it meant, but he stopped climbing the trestle after sunset, and other men noticed. The company foreman, a man named Sullivan, walked the search grid himself on the 4th day, checking every marked post and every section of ground. He found nothing new, but he noticed something the others had missed. The rag strips tied to the fence posts nearest the trestle had been moved, not torn down by the wind, but untied and retied in different spots as though someone had rearranged them in the night. Sullivan asked the search crew if anyone had touched the markers, and every man said no. He retied the strips himself and marked their positions with chalk on the posts. The next morning, 3 of the strips had been moved again, and the chalk marks were still there, untouched. Sullivan did not mention it to the crew, but he stopped marking the posts after that. The older hands in Pennsylvania told the younger ones after that week, "You do not check the belt alone after dusk, and you do not stay on the catwalk when the wind goes still. You do not touch things that feel warm when they should be cold, and you do not follow sounds that come from empty places." The company never issued a formal rule, but the men made their own. By the end of January, no one worked the tipple alone, and the graveyard shift started clearing out an hour before dawn instead of staying through sunrise the way they used to. Wives noticed their husbands coming home earlier, and they did not ask why. On the night of January 21st, exactly 1 week after Mac vanished, Frank the loader was closing up the breaker house when he heard claws on the stairs. He turned fast, his lantern swinging, and saw nothing, but the sound continued, steady and slow, climbing from the base of the trestle toward the catwalk. Frank set his lantern down and backed toward the door, watching the stairs. The sound reached the top and stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then he heard it again, moving along the catwalk toward the breaker end, the same steady click, click, click that Mac's claws used to make. Frank left the lantern where it stood and walked out into the night. He did not go back inside until the next shift arrived at dawn, and when the men asked him why the lantern had been left burning on the floor, he said he had forgotten it. No one believed him, but no one pressed. By the 10th day, there was nowhere left to walk that did not already hold their bootprints, and still nobody had found him, or found anything that explained where a dog could go on a narrow catwalk 40 feet above the ground. The search had become a ritual. Every evening, a small group of men returned to the tipple with lanterns, walking the same grid they had walked the night before, checking the same culverts and the same gaps in the breaker house floor. They no longer expected to find Mac. They were looking for something else now, though none of them said it out loud. Harlan Ketchel walked the catwalk alone on the morning of January 24th, against the advice of every man who worked the tipple. He climbed the stairs just after sunrise when the frost was still thick on the planks and the air was cold enough to make his lungs ache. He walked the entire length of the catwalk slowly, checking every board and every rail, running his hand along the belt housing as though he might find something he had missed 10 days earlier. Near the breaker end, where the oil can had been sitting warm on the frozen planks, he stopped. Tucked into a gap between two boards where the decking met the rail post was a small brass tag. Harlan pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was Mac's collar tag, scratched and dented but unmistakable, with the dog's name stamped into the metal. The tag should not have been there. Harlan had searched that section of the catwalk twice in the first night, on his hands and knees with a lantern held low to catch every shadow, and a dozen other men had walked over it since. The gap between the boards was narrow, barely wide enough to fit the tag, and the metal had been wedged in tight, as though someone had pushed it there deliberately. Harlan turned the tag over in his gloved hand. The back side was smooth and cold, but the front side, the side with the name, was warm. Not hot like the oil can had been, but warm enough that he could feel it through the leather. He stood there for a long time, holding the tag and staring at the empty catwalk stretching out behind him, listening to the wind rattle the tin roof and wondering if he was alone up there. When he climbed down and showed the tag to the others, no one spoke for a full minute. Emil, the slate picker who had touched the oil can barehanded, reached out to take the tag, then stopped with his hand halfway extended. "Where did you find it?" he asked. Harlan told him. Emil shook his head slowly. "I walked that section yesterday morning. There was nothing there." Joseph Lark, who had been watching the catwalk the evening Mac vanished, stepped closer and looked at the tag without touching it. "That's his," he said quietly. "I've seen it 100 times when he used to sleep by the boiler." Harlan nodded and slipped the tag into his coat pocket. It stayed warm against his chest for the rest of the day, and when he took it out that night at home, his wife asked why he was carrying a piece of hot metal in his pocket. He had no answer for her that would make sense. The discovery of the tag changed the search. The men no longer walked the grid looking for a body or a trail. They walked it looking for other things that should not be there, small objects that might appear where they had not been before. On the second night after Harlan found the tag, Peter the slate picker found a second oil can sitting on the catwalk near the breaker end, in almost the exact spot where the first one had been. It was identical to the first can, down to the dent in the side and the rust along the rim, and it was warm. Peter backed away without touching it and called for the others. When they climbed up together, the can was still there, still warm, though the air temperature had dropped below freezing and a thin sheet of ice coated the railings. Harlan checked the tool shed. His oil can, the one he had placed on the catwalk 10 days earlier, was still there, hanging on its peg where he had put it after bringing it down. The second can had come from somewhere else, or from nowhere at all. Some of the men said Harlan must have enemies, someone who wanted to frighten him or drive him away from the tipple. Others said it was a prank, a cruel joke played by one of the younger hands who did not understand what had happened to the dog. But no one could explain how a second oil can identical to the first had appeared on a catwalk that two men had walked just an hour earlier, and no one could explain why it was warm, or why it stayed warm for 3 hours until Sullivan finally carried it down and locked it in the tool shed next to the first one. The men avoided the tool shed after that, and when they needed tools, they sent the youngest workers to fetch them, 2 at a time. A few of the older men, the ones who had worked the coal fields in Pennsylvania long enough to see things they did not talk about, offered a different explanation. They said the land around the tipple had never felt right, that the breaker had been built too close to something old, something that did not like being disturbed. They said the dog had wandered into a place he should not have gone, and now the place was sending things back, small things, familiar things, but wrong in ways that made your skin crawl. One of them, Ed Kovach, said he had heard stories from his father about mining camps in the mountains where men vanished on clear nights and left their tools behind, still warm from their hands. He said the men who stayed in those camps learned to work in pairs and never to touch anything that felt warm when it should be cold. He said the camps that did not learn those rules did not last long, and the coal companies never listed those sites in their records. The women in the company houses began to change their routines. Mothers told their children not to play near the tipple after school, and they walked them to the lane every morning to make sure they stayed on the main road. Clara Dennison, who had heard the barking the night Mac vanished, stopped hanging laundry on the line that faced the breaker house. She said the view made her uncomfortable now, though she would not say why. Another woman, whose husband worked the graveyard shift, started leaving a lamp burning in the window all night, even though lamp oil was expensive and the company frowned on waste. When a neighbor asked her why, she said she wanted her husband to see the light when he walked home in the dark. The neighbor did not ask again. The tag stayed in Harlan's coat pocket for 2 weeks, and every day it was warm. He tried leaving it in the tool shed overnight, thinking maybe the warmth would fade if he was not carrying it. But when he picked it up the next morning, it was still warm. He tried wrapping it in cloth and placing it in a tin box, but the warmth seeped through the fabric and the metal. His wife finally told him to get rid of it, to throw it in the slag heap or bury it somewhere far from the house. But Harlan could not bring himself to do it. The tag was all that was left of Mac, and throwing it away felt like admitting the dog was truly gone. So he kept it, and the warmth against his chest became something he stopped noticing, like a dull ache that never quite went away. On the night of February 7th, 3 weeks after Mac vanished, Frank the loader was walking past the base of the trestle on his way to the tool shed when he heard claws on the catwalk again. He stopped and looked up. The catwalk was empty, but the sound was clear and steady, moving from the stairs toward the breaker. Frank stood still, listening, and then he heard something else. A low sound, halfway between a growl and a whine, coming from somewhere above the shaker floor. He called out, asking if anyone was up there, but no one answered. The sound stopped. Frank waited another minute, then turned and walked back to the breaker house without going to the tool shed. He did not tell anyone what he had heard until years later, when most of the men who had worked the tipple that winter were gone, and it felt safer to speak. After that night, nobody in Pennsylvania worked the tipple alone. The company never issued a rule, but the men enforced it among themselves with a firmness that surprised the younger workers. New hires were told on their first day. 2 men, never one, and always before dark. The older hands said you do not walk the catwalk when the wind goes still, and you do not touch things that feel warm when they should be cold. They said the tipple remembers what happened there, and some nights it tries to give pieces of it back. They did not explain what they meant, and the new hires did not ask. The tipple stood for another 15 years after Mac vanished, and in all that time no one walked the catwalk alone after dusk. The rule became so deeply embedded in the work culture that new hires learned it before they learned how to operate the belt controls or read the coal weight gauges. Foreman told them on the first morning, 2 men, never one, and if the wind drops all at once while you're up there, you come down. No exceptions. Most of the young workers nodded and forgot about it by lunchtime, until an older hand pulled them aside and explained it again, more carefully this time, with details they wished they had not heard. The years changed the tipple, but did not erase what had happened there. The company replaced the catwalk decking in 1936, pulling up the old frost-split planks and laying down new lumber treated with creosote. The workers doing the job found Mac's collar tag wedged between two joists near the breaker end, exactly where Harlan had found it 12 years earlier, though Harlan swore he had kept the tag in his coat pocket until the day he left the coal patch for good. The crew foreman picked up the tag with a gloved hand and dropped it into a coffee can without looking at it closely. The can was sealed and buried in the slag heap that same afternoon. No one wanted it in the tool shed. 3 days later, another tag appeared in the same spot, and this time the foreman left it where it lay. The oil cans disappeared and reappeared throughout the 1930s, always in winter, always near the breaker end of the catwalk. Sometimes it was one can, sometimes two, sitting upright on the planks as though someone had just set them down. They were always warm. Workers learned to leave them where they stood and report them to the foreman, who would collect them at the end of the shift and lock them away. By 1940, the tool shed held 11 identical oil cans, all with the same dent and the same rust pattern, all of them warm to the touch no matter how long they sat in the cold shed. Sullivan, the foreman, finally had them taken to the county dump and buried under 6 feet of slag and ash. But 2 weeks later, another can appeared on the catwalk, and then another. After that, the company stopped trying to get rid of them. They just collected them and stacked them in the back corner of the shed, where the warmth they gave off kept the room a few degrees warmer than it should have been all winter long. The sound of claws on the catwalk became part of the night shift routine. Men heard it often enough that they stopped reacting with fear and started reacting with caution, the way you might step carefully around a loose board or a frayed cable. When the sound started, usually around midnight or just before dawn, the workers on the sorting floor would glance up briefly, then go back to their tasks. No one climbed up to check anymore. There was never anything to find. And the men who had checked in the early years said it was better not to know what you might see if you looked too closely. Frank, who had heard the growl whine above the shaker floor in 1933, told younger workers that the tipple had claimed something it should not have, and now it did not know how to let go. He said the best thing you could do was respect it and keep working. He said the men who tried to fight it or explain it always left within a month, and the men who stayed were the ones who learned to live with it. Harlan Ketchell left the coal patch in 1937 and moved west to Ohio, where he found work on a farm far from any mines or industrial sites. He told his wife he was done with coal, done with company towns, and done with places that felt wrong. He never spoke about Mac or the catwalk again, not even when his children asked why he would not go near the barn alone after dark. His wife said he kept a small brass tag in a box on his dresser until the day he died in 1952, and that the tag was always warm, even on the coldest mornings. She buried it with him, wrapped in cloth and tucked into his coat pocket, and no one in the family asked why. The stories about the tipple spread beyond the coal patch. Miners working other sites in Pennsylvania heard about the dog that vanished and the warm oil cans that kept appearing, and they started telling their own stories about places that did not give back what they took. One man said he had worked a mine in the western part of the state where a lamp would reappear on a shelf, days after a miner went missing, still burning as though it had never been carried underground. Another said he knew of a breaker in the north where footsteps echoed in the dust chutes long after the machinery was shut down for good. A third said his father had worked a site where tools would move overnight, always arranged in the same pattern, always facing the same direction, as though someone was still trying to finish a job that had been interrupted years before. The stories were always told quietly, in the few minutes before a shift started or during a smoke break outside, and they were never written down. But the rules that came from those stories were followed as strictly as any company regulation. By 1945, the anthracite industry in Pennsylvania was shrinking. The tipple where Mac vanished was decommissioned in 1948, and the company sold the land to a salvage firm that dismantled the breaker house and the conveyor trestle for scrap metal. The workers doing the dismantling said they found things that did not make sense. Brass tags with names stamped into them, oil cans with no rust despite being left out in the weather for years, and a section of catwalk planks that felt warm to the touch even though the structure had been sitting cold and abandoned for months. The salvage foreman ordered the planks burned and the tags buried, and the crew did not ask questions. One of the workers, a man who had not grown up in the coal patch and did not know the story, tried to keep one of the oil cans as a souvenir. He said it stayed warm in his truck all the way home, and when he brought it inside his house that evening, his dog refused to come near it. He threw it in a creek the next day and never mentioned it again. By 1950, the site was empty except for the concrete foundation posts and a flat stretch of ground where the company houses used to stand. The land stayed empty for more than a decade. Developers who looked at the site said the ground was too unstable for building, though the coal company's own surveys had never mentioned any structural problems. In the 1960s, a housing development finally went up. But the houses built on the land where the tipple had stood turned over quickly. Families moved in and moved out within a year or two, always citing vague reasons. The neighborhood did not feel right. The children did not sleep well. The basement stayed too warm in winter. By the 1980s, those houses were rented instead of sold, and the turnover slowed as people learned not to ask too many questions about places that felt a little wrong. But the rules stayed. Men who had worked the tipple carried them to other jobs, other coal sites, other industrial towns across Pennsylvania and beyond. They taught their sons and nephews the same things they had been taught. You do not work alone in places that feel wrong. You do not touch things that are warm when they should be cold. And you do not ignore the sound of claws on metal when there is nothing alive that could make that sound. The rules were not written in any company manual, but they were taught as carefully as any safety procedure. And the men who learned them understood that some rules exist because of things that cannot be explained in an accident report. People in Pennsylvania still talk about the dog that vanished on a coal tipple in 1933. The story has been told and retold so many times that the details have softened at the edges, but the core remains the same. A dog walked onto a catwalk and did not come back, and the place where he vanished kept trying to return pieces of him for years afterward. Some people say it was an accident, that the dog fell through a gap in the decking too small to see and landed somewhere the searchers never thought to look. Others say it was a prank that went too far, or a crime that was never solved. But the people who worked the tipple or who knew someone who did offer a different version. They say the dog walked into something that was already there, something that had always been there, and that the warm oil cans and the brass tags and the sound of claws on frozen planks were not hauntings but reminders. Small, insistent reminders that some disappearances do not follow the rules of the world we understand. The coal patch where the tipple stood is gone now, buried under new streets and housing developments that were built in the 1960s. The people who live there do not know what used to stand on that ground, and most of them have never heard the story of Mac or the catwalk or the oil cans that would not stay buried. But there are a few older residents, the children and grandchildren of the men who worked the breaker, who still follow rules they cannot quite explain. They do not walk certain streets alone after dark. They do not touch metal objects left sitting in the cold if those objects feel warm. And they tell their own children, without quite knowing why, that some places remember things longer than people do. Which version makes sense here? The accident, the crime, or the impossible one nobody in Pennsylvania dares to say out loud? What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? The warm oil cans that multiplied and reappeared for 15 years, the brass tag that stayed warm until it was buried, or the sound of claws walking a catwalk that held nothing alive? And why do people in Pennsylvania, decades after the tipple was torn down, still teach their children not to work alone in places that feel wrong? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.